Hello, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Duffin at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I'm a retired hematologist and historian, and I want you to know that Kingston is situated on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. And today I'm chatting with my friend and colleague, Darrel Manitowabi, who is a professor at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. Darrel, tell us about yourself and your job.
Greetings, everyone. I would say in Anishinaabe, Nani Bojo, Kinawaya, Miigwech, Kinawaya, Gibzindwik. So thank you all for listening to this. So my name is Darrel Manitowabi. I am Three Fires Anishinaabe from Manitoulin Island, more specifically Weequampong Unceded Territory, which is on the eastern end of Manitoulin Island in Georgian Bay. I currently live in Whitefish River First Nation, which is just across from the island on the mainland in the traditional territory of the Robinson-Huron Treaty. And I am currently the Jason A. Hannah Chair in the History of Indigenous Traditional Medicine and Indigenous Health. And in the Human Sciences Division at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine University. So we say NOSM, the acronym for short, and that's who I am.
Thank you. I'd like to mention also that it's a very beautiful, sunny, but extremely cold winter day here in Kingston. We're at minus 16 degrees centigrade. How about you?
We are about minus 20 some, I believe, the last I checked. I'm in Whitefish River First Nation as I shared, and so yeah, it's rather cold here, and it's the coldest time of the year thus far.
Yes, for us too. And for the Americans listening, that's about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Um, can you tell us a bit about your job? You started in 2020. That was right in the middle of the pandemic, basically. And you are the inaugural professor in that chair. Can you tell us about what you were supposed to do at NOSM?
Yeah, so I joined, as you stated, I joined in the time of COVID, which is a less than ideal time, especially when you're starting a new job. Everything is, or there's intermittent openings, which is very difficult for someone who needs to access a library. Um, One of the more recent collaborations I had, just by way of example, is with Dr. Jeff Hudson, who's a historian of medicine at the medical school. We have a chapter in the book An Accidental History of Canada, and we wrote about Manitoulin Island accidents from settler and Indigenous perspectives. And it was the most difficult chapter I've ever had to write because I couldn't access anything. Everything was closed. And when it was open, it was only for a narrow window. So it almost felt as though you needed to expedite your process, right? And so that's how I would describe that initial experience, just by way of example. And a lot of my work involves working with elders and traditional healers. So my approach to this chair is quite a bit different than it has been in the past. And I'll just give you another example of that. So when I first started this chair, I went to the Indigenous community to help inform the kind of work I would do. So typically, an academic embraces autonomy and academic freedom and all those sorts of things and goes about doing things that is in part conditioned by the academy and the expectations of that. And so I reversed that and I took an approach that wherein I am conditioned and I'm in sync with community. And one of the things that community determined to be important is to build capacity in understanding traditional healing and its place within contemporary society, and that involves coming together. So, since 2020, I've been consulting with elders, traditional healers, and we've been determining a pathway forward. And it's a continuous preparatory aspect of the work that I'm doing. And so I've been focused mostly on that. But aside, I consider my approach to be a kind of a two-wide seeing, which is this perspective of blending, Western knowledge with Indigenous knowledge. But the way that I've I've operationalized it is I'm blending university logic and expectations with community logic and expectations. And I try to do enough of the university stuff to satisfy, those eyes, and I also concentrate the balance of my time with community. So it's a juggling act. It's a balancing act. It's recognizing that there's an incompatibility in essence with how community sees knowledge production and would like to see it done, and how the university does. The university is a hierarchical, individualized process, where in community it's more of a collective process. We do things together, and so we are collective. We are a collective group of authors and collaborators rather than a hierarchical individual leading a group. So I'm not leading anyone when I'm in community. I'm working alongside. So that's what I'm doing there. So and Indigenous Medicine Stories is what we're going to talk about here is the essence of what that means. It's kind of bridging those two worlds. It's like bridging those two ways of experiencing and practicing knowledge.
Well, right away, you've kind of explained to me the origin of Indigenous medicine stories. Uh, they seem to be an extrapolation of what you envisaged your job to be. Um, did you have the idea before you went for that job, or was it something that came to you while you were um, inventing what you should be at NOSM?
So I'll come back to COVID. So COVID explains a lot. So during COVID, we needed to modify our curriculum to reflect remote learning. And given the work that we were doing, we do a lot of experiential stuff, having elders come into the classroom at the medical school in year one, and there's even an Indigenous placement. That became a bit of a challenge. So what we ended up doing is doing things like everyone else in front of a computer screen. And that's a challenge with learn. It's exhausting. I remember those long days of just staring at my computer screen, doing presentations and not having that human connection. And one of the or a few of the students had raised the question that, we should consider alternative ways of experiencing this or learning. And one had mentioned one or more, I can't remember if it was one or two or more than that, mentioned podcasts. And I thought, that's an interesting idea. And at the same time, I was thinking about a project that involved collections of life histories of elders and healers, akin to a book by David Newhouse and Don McCaskill. That was, I think it's in the Wisdom of Elders or something along those lines, where they essentially traveled across Canada and they collected life stories of elders from across Canada, and it's literally their life story. It's their narrative that forms the basis of the chapter. And also this other project that took place, the Indian film project that was at the University of Regina, the Canadian Plains Research Center. And what they did is they traveled across, or someone traveled across Canada. It wasn't always the same person, and they sat down with people of significance of Indigenous ancestry. It might have been an elder or a leader or a healer, and they just asked questions, and they collected a transcript of of what their experience was like. And it almost seemed as though it was a bit of a random process that you weren't quite sure what the purpose of that interview was, but it produced a lot of important information and an important historical record. And many of those individuals who took part in that are no longer with us now. So it's become an important archive. And so when I was thinking about those three things all at once, the concept of a podcast came about. And I thought, well, I could have guests speak about their experience in their own words, and I could generate an archival record by way of the voice, but also by way of the transcript in what they're speaking of. And so I brought this idea. I was having a conversation with Anne Avery at the Associate Medical Services, and she had mentioned that they had done a podcast, and we just continued talking, and we just came to the conclusion, why not collaborate? Why not work together on this? And so that's how it all came about. But it was the intersection of all of those things that were happening that led to this. And as I thought about it further, and I'll just expand upon this, one of the things that I consider to be an interesting aspect of the podcast, or and of the approach that I take, is having the guests speak about themselves in their own words, which also reflects back to what I mentioned before, in the sense that I try to speak as little as possible, and I try to highlight the voice of the person, have the person talk about their life in their own words, on their own terms, and I'm merely a conduit to that, or a bridge to that, opening the door of understanding. It also reflects the fact that academia traditionally, and in the research that I've done, I do a lot of oral history research where I speak with elders. And one of the frustrations I've always had is that they have so much important ideas to share, but I must edit things down to one or two sentences, or perhaps, if I'm lucky, five sentences. And I thought, there needs to be a mechanism, or a medium by which, that comes to an end. So that was also an aspect of it, but it's also, again, that relationship. And so I don't see this as my mine. I don't see this as being the authority over. I see this as a visit, a way to learn and to engage. And I also specifically approach it by way of highlighting the life history. So quite often elders, academics, and others are called upon to do something specific to their job, whether if you're an elder, you're doing a teaching, or if you're a researcher, you're discussing your research. Rarely do we ever have a chance to understand, where are you coming from? Who are you? Where did you grow up? Who were your teachers? What was that like? And so it's really about them telling their story. And so it became a way for me to navigate, or balance, or weave in this interface of the university and the community in a creative way that allows for that outcome. And one of the, and I won't forget to mention this, one of the significant aspects as well is the educational component. It links to my chair, the AMS chair. One of the in one of the features of it is to help to, and you might have your own perspective on this, Jackie, because you've had a longstanding chair, is to find ways of inserting these kinds of perspectives in medical school curriculum by way of encouraging research with students, or advancing curriculum in a particular kind of way, or doing scholarly activities and creative work such as this, that helps to demonstrate to biomedically inclined future physicians that there is a humanistic aspect to healing and medicine, and also like the historical aspect. So those all are all coming together, and are all influencing how things came to be. And so that's a little bit of an insight into the origin.
Well, for those who haven't been to look at Indigenous medicine stories, and we will certainly explain at MedHum how to find them, they are a wonderful cluster of podcasts. They're not short. They run up to an hour or so, and right now there's about 22 of them there. You've already answered some of my questions about not only where it came from, but how it can be used. I'm interested in if it is difficult to get people to talk. I know you have a PhD in anthropology, and I believe you used oral history to get there when you were writing your thesis. But is it difficult to encourage people to talk, especially if they're being recorded? And one quick question, tell us about that beautiful image you have behind you, which is the title page of Indigenous Medicine Stories.
Mhm. Yeah, let me get to the title page, the artwork first, then I'll jump into that. So, I needed a logo, and at the time I was searching for ideas, and one of the initial concepts I had was to take a picture of medicines, and so I did that, and I thought, well, I was thinking about that, but I have there's a young community member where I live here, Whitefish River First Nation, a young aspiring artist by the name of Nevada and Watton. And Nevada had a collection of paintings, and I just was interested in seeing if she had something that kind of really connected. And once I saw this, I knew right away that it was the perfect piece of art that would serve as a logo, and it also represents the future because it's from a young Indigenous artist who's a female, and also it reflects ceremony. So the image is of us of what we understand to be a sweat lodge. There's different words for that word, but anyways, it's a sweat lodge, and there's a vision that is coming out through this is my interpretation. So Nevada will have her own inspiration and interpretation, but this is what I saw when I looked at it. It's engaging with the spiritual essence of ceremony, and it's in beautiful colors. So I thought, this is the artwork that I needed, and so that's how that decision was made. And to answer your next question about, is it difficult? I would say in part, it's what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to capture different stories and experiences. So I'm looking for different standpoints, right? So you might be a practitioner, or you might be, balancing, for instance, a social work perspective to helping and including Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous helping in that. You might be a researcher, for instance. You might be from a different locale, or a cultural experience or group. So those are all kind of factoring in, and it's also about convenience. I'm doing this alongside my everyday work, and so if I happen to be in a part of the province where I know somebody is, I'll try to make that connection. One of the essential aspects of this is to have that face to face. And so it's a blend. So the ideal for me is to do an in-person recording, if that's possible. But I've also, done them remotely, remote recordings through Riverside, by way of example. If I know it's going to be Riverside, I make it I make it essential that I meet with them in person beforehand. And so the more challenging part is to build that relationship, because there needs to be some work invested into that. I'm not saying a whole lot, but there needs to be some kind of connection, because as human beings we interact, face to face, and communicate in those kinds of ways. So the initial first grouping was a bit of a balance between those who I had somewhat known or had known of me. I had met them before, and in some instances that might not have been the case, but it was mostly that scenario. And so they were comfortable with me. And so I also emphasized the spirit and intent, right? It's about education, and they recognize the guests on the podcast recognize the context in which things are, where Indigenous peoples are not understood. There's a lot of discrimination, a lot of conscious and unconscious bias in social interactions. There's an exclusion of, these ideas in, the formal education. So all Indigenous peoples are experts in these things. They know it. They know it from their inner essence and their being. And so they understand the potential that education can have in trying to address this. And so in from my perspective, they see themselves as trying to change things, as am I, right? So we both recognize that. And I centralize education because with education, I'd like to humanize an understanding of traditional healers. I've been talking about Indigenous Indigenous issues for my entire teaching career. I've been, mentoring, I've just passed 20 years of doing that now. And I know, since the beginning, there's this reaction towards anything Indigenous. You could just say the word Indigenous, I'm going back 10, 15 years, and you can trigger a response by some people. You could trigger a physiological response just by mentioning Native, First Nations, Inuit, Indigenous, etc. And so I've always known that, and I've experienced that in the classroom. And so when I speak about Indigenous healing, especially towards a group that it has is trained in the sciences, for instance, there's this instant reaction towards it with the assumption that it's inherently unscientific, or it's all made up. It has no place. It's just this interesting cultural phenomena or social phenomena. If you look at it, if you use science to look at it, you could draw the conclusion that there's an essential inherent bias in understanding this, because there's assumptions based on that, and science is not supposed to be based on assumptions and bias. So anyways, going on to things there. So I thought that, if people could hear the story of the person, hear their life experience, they could recognize that, this is a human being that exists in this world, and they have experiences just like I do. And I have no right to assume that they're inferior because of the socialization in which I come from in respect to Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples. So that's part of it. It's about educating. And and I'll just even add here, I'm kind of going on in a direction here. I'll even add for Indigenous peoples themselves, I see this as a new medium of communication. And it's a consequence of the impact of a digital world in which we're faced with. And it's really adapting to that. So in times in the past, this knowledge would have been shared by way of storytelling. It may have been, on the land. It could have been around a table. I grew up at a time when there was very little TV channels. I like to say two and a half channels, because the third channel worked half the time. And so I spent most of the time outside and in the community. And I would just be around. And in the process of just being around, I learned a lot. I learned a lot because I would be around stories, around people telling stories, around elders who would be telling stories, and I would just be I was part of the furniture in that sense. And so those days are not here in the present. Maybe they'll return in the future. So I see this as a new form of storytelling, a digital storytelling, right? And so there's some literature out there on that. Jennifer Wemigwans has a book on it, and I see this as being part of that process, right? So it's it serves a purpose for different audiences in a medium that is compatible with both of those sides, right? And I think that both sides are looking for something different. Those who are just, curious about what this all means, for instance, from, a non-Indigenous perspective. But from Indigenous perspective, there's a built-in marketing, because many of the people that I've spoken to are known, right? So
Mm.
they're known in the Indigenous community, but they're not known outside of that. So, and that also relates back to your original question about inviting people. I know who these people are. We're part of a community. We're part of, people who know somebody, right? So, we're not so far removed in this area anyway. And I'm also focusing initially mostly on Northern Ontario, obviously because that's where I work, but also because there's a tendency to invest in creative works and knowledge production in places where capital is concentrated. And in the province of Ontario, it's concentrated in Southern Ontario. So you have this, this natural tendency, I suppose, within that framework to collect knowledge in those areas. In Northern Ontario, there's little research in all aspects of research in itself. And so I think I have a responsibility to reflect, and it also comes back to the social accountability mandate of the Northern Ontario School of Medicine University, which is to reflect the society in which it is located. And so I try to reflect the work that I do in the society in which I'm located. And so I've said quite a bit of things there, and so that's kind of where things are at. I'm always recording, and I don't know how long this is going to go, but I'm going to take it as far as I can and continue this work, because there's a lot of important lives that are being lived out there that many of us have not learned about or heard about.
Right. Thank you for that wonderful answer. Uh, so I understand that, first of all, you know a lot of people in the community, and second of all, all of you, your interviewees, as well as you, feel a responsibility to pass on knowledge, and this educational opportunity is a trigger for why they might accept to be recorded. I have two more questions. They're medicine stories, and in looking at some of them, I'm interested in hearing you tell us what you think medicine is or is about, because medicine is there to treat disease. We take medicine to get rid of disease, and healing is a very important word in your podcast. So what is the medicine? What is being healed?
Okay, and I'm glad you asked that question. Another aspect of, it brings to mind that I neglected to talk about something else. So traditional medicine or traditional healing is often stated as being holistic. That's maybe a common denominator in most of the definitions you come across or what people have to say. However, the stereotype is that it's limited to plant medicines. It's limited to this material consumption of something to relieve something, to have this particular, outcome. And that's, a Western paradigm within healing in itself. And I've heard this from healers that, it's more than that. It's more than that. And so really that's what I'm getting at. Really what they're doing. And so this is where an aspect of comes in. This is also a form of Indigenous pedagogy, which is a way of Indigenous learning, and storytelling was that way of learning, of teaching and learning. But there was also, obviously observation that happened, and you go about it and do what you need to do. But one element of it is storytelling. And I've read these historical accounts that Indigenous peoples would tell stories all winter long. So this is the time of storytelling, a time of education. And so that's the legacy. And often Indigenous peoples will tell stories by way of an answer. And this is what I try to teach in the classroom, that, when we have a placement at NOSM for students to go into an Indigenous community for 4 weeks. And one of the things I tell them, so I help them prepare for it, I tell them that, you're going to ask an elder a question, they're going to tell you a story. And in that story, they're actually answering that question for you. And you may not know the answer to that question immediately, but it might come a time in the future where you recall that story and you make that connection. It's a form of autonomous learning where the teacher or the elder or the storyteller tells the story, and it's up to the individual, to the listener, to get it or not. And at some point in time, they will. So in essence, it's a bit of an assessment. Like, where are you at in terms of your knowledge and comprehension and understanding? And I use that by way of an example because the stories that are being told are precisely about Indigenous healing and Indigenous medicines, in the sense that they're a reflection upon the legacy of colonialism in Canada and the violence that it is instilling on people of the past and the present, and the impact that that has on people's lives, and how that translates into and manifests into these physiological outcomes that, a biomedical lens can offer. But it also speaks to, you can, from a biomedical standpoint, you could look at, stress, the impact of stress on health. You could look at childhood development. You could take all of these frameworks and apply them if you wish to do so. However, the way that it's spoken about, it's about trauma and healing and how that's overcome. And often I will come across and even know that these seemingly abstract human experiences are actually medical or medicine for Indigenous peoples. For instance, just learning more about teachings can offer healing for an individual who is yearning for that, maybe through the colonial process that was excluded, and it's a void in their life, and they need it. They need that reason and purpose and identity and a sense of being and understanding. And that relates to mental health and also, physical health as well. And so they're seeking an answer to their situation. And this is helpful for them. It's also, I like to say that it's not the only solution, but it's a way of, it's part of, part of the answer, right? So obviously, meeting in person with someone is the best possible outcome. But it's maybe a gateway towards that, ideally, that it offers an opportunity for those to reach out to others. And so really it's also about them telling us about what they see it being. And again, it's from different perspectives, right? So you might have a researcher who's chatting about what this means. It might be, I've had an Indigenous physician guest who talks about finding a way to include. It could be an elder. Knowledge is a form of wisdom, and some of that relates to a healing wisdom. And it could be a practitioner, or it could be a helper. And it could even be about human relationships, right? You could translate some of this into a social determinants of health framework.
Yeah.
And so there's various ways of interpreting, but it's much like the story of the artwork that I shared, that is the logo. It allows for the listener to draw the knowledge that they need, or the teaching that they need at that moment in time, at the level that they're at, on their own terms. And so there's nothing here is being imposed on anyone. And when I'm asking the questions, I'm simultaneously processing what the listener may be thinking, and I deliberately do not reveal too much of the details, for instance, right? And I leave it up to the listener to figure that part out, right? So there is, in essence, in some part, of responsibility, but I'm not doing it for the person. And like, for instance, someone might be talking about the meaning of ceremony in their life, and I don't dig too deep. I just kind of touch upon the surface. And I let it's up to the listener to dig deeper if they need to, right? And so this is what I'm talking about here, in terms of this non-hierarchical way of learning, this Indigenous pedagogy, where there's responsibility that is understood to exist with the person who seeks to learn. And there and the teacher, or the one who's telling the story, is not imposing things, um in part somewhat seemingly abstract, but is directly saying what needs to be said, and giving that option to the listener. This is what I'm telling you. If you don't understand what I'm saying to you, it means you have more work to do.
Yes.
If you do understand what I'm saying to you, then you have a choice, to take something from this if you would like. You don't need to do so. And that is it, right?
That's
And so,
that's
yeah,
very intriguing, because it is a different way of conceiving of medicine and also of healing. And I got the message early on in looking at the podcast that the disease we're healing is a collective as well. in our society, a historical legacy in a sense. The last question I want to ask you is about stories themselves as a form of knowledge. You've made it quite clear that it's a way of answering and giving information among First Nations people. It's a traditional way of understanding. But you've got me thinking, since I've been looking at your podcast, that medicine does that too, in the sense that we take a history of every patient and we're not supposed to impose too much, just as you suggest, but we curate those histories. And the other way that storytelling is a form of knowledge in medicine is the case of the case histories, which go back to antiquity, in the sense that we build a disease concept from multiple case histories of people who've had similar symptoms or similar experiences. And so, for the last question, I want you to talk about storytelling as a form of knowledge.
Okay, so let me situate that with a Anishinaabe understanding of things. And so there are two forms of stories. One form of storytelling is Dabajimo or Dabajimowin or Dabajimowinun, which is, stories of the past of events that have occurred. And there are sacred stories, and that is referred to as Ansokan or Ansokanak. And the difference between those two, well, sacred speaks for itself. They're mythic, sacred. One of those stories, is alive, and that's Ansokanak, and those are sacred stories. And so we don't really engage upon sacred stories in Indigenous medicine stories, but we do focus on, the Bachmanwin and those stories of lives lived. So I just wanted to kind of situate that those are two forms of storytelling. And really, I think, to come back to kind of engage with your answer at the start here, I see commonality in humanity, and even commonality in intellectual paradigms. And, it's almost as though we've been conditioned to be in opposition in many ways. Like we're still tribal peoples at our core, and we're the scientists, and this is, you can interpret this as being a story, but we're going to call this a case history, and we're going to call it this, and it's not going to be that. But I'm coming in, I'm like, and as you've described, you're talking about something that's very similar, and some of this may be indigestible to some and incompatible, but so at some point in time maybe that might not be the case, but that's how I approach this. And so I see commonality. I often talk about, narrative medicine. You'll be familiar with that, on, how that's kind of framed as this, academic understanding of what you described, that this way of, telling our stories to the physician, or even maybe to the patient sometimes. And I bring in story work. And this is when I talk about this academically, like I'm doing this now. Joanne Archibald, a Canadian academic from BC, Indigenous Canadian academic, writes about story work and a way of teaching. But it really comes down to the inner essence of this history of Indigenous learning in itself, right? And I just described that, Ansel Khan and the Bajmo, and how, stories have always been part of things, right? And I like to tell this story about, I was doing this project with the First Nations Information Governance Center on Indigenous perspectives of poverty. And I was speaking to a Mi'kmaq, and this is in the east of Canada, a Mi'kmaq, I'll say knowledge holder, academic. I asked him 6 questions, and he told me 6 stories. And the stories were over 2 hours long. And it was after about maybe 90 minutes where he paused and he confessed. He goes, I I don't know if I'm answering your question, and I don't know if you're understanding what I'm saying. And I said, I understand precisely what you're saying. Keep on going. And when he came to the end in that research project, I just felt that at a loss, because I could only capture maybe a minute or two of nearly 2 hours of very, very interesting stories that he was telling me that were just vibrant and alive. I could just feel and sense the detail of what he was talking about. And so, really, that's what this is all about. It's about demonstrating the utility of Indigenous storytelling in educating, because that's what these are all about. And an elder or storyteller, or just an elder, or most will tell you a story anyway, right? They'll just jump into story, and it's just how it is, right? And it's almost like this natural inclination of how to answer a question, because I think it makes it more interesting when I hear stories about people's lives and about experiences that they've had. It's more interesting. There may be, I think you can remember it in much more detail. Like, and I'll just give you another example. I was going down this body of water close to where I live, where I hadn't gone to before when I was new to boating. And I was speaking to an experienced, person in the community who knew the waters very well. And he was telling me by way of story about how to navigate those waters. And it was almost like generating a mental map in my mind through the anticipated experience that I would go through in order to really kind of paint a picture of a map of where to go. And he also did that with even hunting, where he would tell me, okay, you got to go here, and then he would kind of generate this portrait of this place. And as I was going through those experiences, I could hear the voice in my mind describing what I was seeing as I was doing it. So it was kind of like an original kind of a GPS kind of experience. And I'll just give you one more example of this. When I was early in my career, I was teaching Indigenous studies at the University of Sudbury, which was, formerly a federated university of Laurentian University in Sudbury, Northeastern Ontario. And I had invited an elder to come speak to the class. And I thought, they were learning all of these things. I was teaching a course on Indigenous tradition, culture, and spirituality. And so I thought, maybe I'll invite an elder to the class. And the elder came in, and, I just gave a general idea, a general orientation to what the content was about. And, I didn't impose on what they should talk about, but, I just offered that's a useful direction to go. And over the course of an hour, the elder was telling stories about life and life stages and all of these things. And I found it fascinating. I was just captivated myself while I was sitting in the audience with the students. I just took a little pause and I looked around, and I realized that some had no idea what was going on, that they were expecting this structured lesson plan with learning outcomes and content that would correlate some way to those learning outcomes. And then, if they were being evaluated, there would be some kind of, assessment associated with that. And I just came to the realization that, there is something different here, and there's something worthwhile to consider. And so after, the next class, I had basically deconstructed things for students to explain that, this is how things happen. So this is how I began to learn that this is something that I needed to explain, because it's just something that just happens in its natural form. And also, and as this relates to myself here, it I didn't immediately understand the meaning of all of what that elder had stated that day. I understood some or most of it, and it was probably about maybe 5 to 7 years after the fact that I remembered that story. And I still remember the story. And this is like 15 years ago, right? So this maybe speaks to the power of story in itself. It was 5 or 7 years after that point in time that it was like a eureka moment, that this is what that elder was telling me. I didn't understand it at that time, but now I understand it. And I remember that story, and I remember what they were trying to tell me. And they were actually doing something that they thought was important for young people to know. And at that time, I was young myself. And so, stories are very powerful, and I think it's the ideal medium to 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 transmit knowledge, and to even translate knowledge in this essence. And If the listener does not yet know what's going on, then, at some point in time, possibly they will, and they may return back to the story and find something new. And, that's the neat thing about learning. Sometimes you return back to a book you read 10 years ago and you find something new to learn and understand about it. So the same is the case with Indigenous medicine stories.
That's wonderful. Darrel, miigwech, thank you so much.
Yeah, Nahau, thank you for having me, and I look forward to sharing more Indigenous medicine stories with all of those who are interested in hearing them.
And we'll look forward to hearing them.